David, I'm going to start by quoting someone else, but someone who you quote in the beginning of your book and who has also been on this podcast recently, which is Amy Wax, legal scholar, American legal scholar. She writes of care. Care is today undersupplied because more than most activities, it generates positive externalities that do not flow to the caregiver. This creates a mismatch between effort and reward that used to be solved by restricting women's opportunities to do anything else. Having relaxed those restrictions, we do not have an alternative solution and are today living with the consequences. I thought that was a wonderful quote in summing up the problem. And I suppose my opening question is, what are those consequences? How are we suffering from this blessed but also very difficult historical change?
My book is called The Care Dilemma, and this is the dilemma. Since we've seen the mass movement of women into the GDP economy, we have invested less in the domestic sphere. I mean, not economically. We invest far more in the welfare state, in welfare functions, and so on. But the overall sort of investment of time and status has swung hugely from the domestic sphere into the public sphere, particularly for women in the last 40, 50, 60 years. And that has created a sort of tension between care and equality. And I guess what I'm trying to argue in the book is that we can raise the status of care, of traditionally female fields, female realms of care, without weakening equality, and that the two things should not be seen in tension. Although, as Amy Wax points out, that they are currently. I mean, we are undervaluing the domestic realm, and that is producing all sorts of outcomes that nobody wants. I mean, we're living with the unintended consequences often of positive things, the increases in freedom, the increases in female autonomy, and so on. You could say this is the biggest increase in human freedom since the Second World War. But there are unintended consequences that we do not focus on sufficiently as a society.
I like this expression, the GDP economy. I think that's useful because, of course, care work, it has as a value, not just an emotional value, it has an economic value, which is really quite high. If you actually added up how much one would have to pay to replicate the work that a stay-at-home mother does, for instance, it would be very expensive to employ someone or employ multiple people in reality to do what she does. So it is a valuable thing. But yes, it's not actually accounted for. I think you describe it as a one-time boost to GDP, this mass entry of women into the workforce. Of course, there have always been women working in one way or another. But the thing that we see in the second half of the 20th century, which I guess is historically peculiar, is middle class, relatively affluent women moving into the labour market when they hadn't been there before, at least, or hadn't been there for a long time. I mean, yeah, I suppose talk through a little bit that historical shift. What happened in the second half of the 20th century, which has been so historically unusual?
As you say, women have always worked both inside the home and outside the home, but there was the famous rupture with the Industrial Revolution, where the economic function left the home with men. That this was then women. I mean, obviously some work, both domestic and economic, GDP economic, went on in the home, but the home became less the centre of economic production. There was a period from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, this rather unusual period where many women, particularly middle-class women, were not productive in the GDP economy. But that then ended from the sort of the late 50s to today. The female participation in the labour market went from sort of 25%. I mean, full-time participation went from sort of 25% to just over 70%. Now, we tend to think of that as a sort of simple addition to the sort of plus side of the balance sheet, and we never look at what was lost. We kind of assumed that women were sitting at home twiddling their thumbs, and of course that wasn't the case. I mean, women were not only looking after children and old people and men. They were also at the centre of community life and running charities and so on and so forth. At both ends of the social spectrum. You're the kind of image of the East End working class matriarch, or these sort of county ladies who were also JPs and so on and so forth. There was a huge amount going on, which stopped when, partially stopped when you had this huge movement of women from the domestic realm into, as it were, sort of following men out into the GDP economy. And now, obviously, that's had enormously beneficial. The fact that our GDP economies have access to the brains and energy of women in a way that it didn't. Before, say, the 1960s, the 1970s is a massive thing, but we seem incapable of kind of looking at the other side of the balance sheet. And a lot of what I'm talking about in this book is a sort of trade-off between the GDP economy and kind of well-being. I had intended to sort of go more into the whole sort of GDP question, but actually there isn't really a huge amount you can say about it, except that it would be, we could have alternative statistics that do try to capture, as indeed they already do to some extent. I mean, GDP figures themselves do try and capture some of the of the work that's done in the domestic realm, but we do kind of need we need a better handle on all of this to give us a more honest and accurate picture of what's happening, because I mean we're so over focused on GDP, and I think it so distorts our kind of debate about economy and society. And even now, the treasury model is all about boosting GDP, which is all about increasing employment, whether it's through mass immigration or through pushing women back into the workforce as soon as they've had babies, often against their will. But look at the numbers. I mean, we're already way above average for the OECD countries. We have our labour market participation rate is, I think, about 75%. Women are slightly lower than men, but that's what you're well into the upper quarter of OECD countries, and we're obsessed by pushing it even higher. But so many countries have lower labour market participation rates, but much higher economic growth, much higher productivity. Indeed, you could almost say there's a sort of reverse trade-off. But you push low productivity people who are probably rather reluctant to be there, like recent mothers, into low productivity jobs in the GDP economy. I mean, it's which kind of superficially increases GDP, but doesn't actually boost per capita growth very much. We're also obsessed by the inactivity rate. And again, the inactivity rate is actually below the average for rich countries. It's also below the level that it's been. It's below the average level that it's been in the UK in the last 30 or 40 years. Now, there has been a big increase in inactivity as a result of chronic illness, and obviously, I'm sure we'll go on and talk about this. I mean, the sort of the whole epidemic of mental fragility problem, and governments are right to focus on that. We're over focused on the wrong things, I think, and so you end up with people apparently, according to the national accounts, as it were, we're all richer, but actually we feel, and particularly women doing the double shift, feel much more stretched, and you can have rising GDP and falling well-being, and I think we need to try and think more clearly about that.
And famously, female self-reported happiness has dropped over the exact same period that female economic freedom supposedly has increased. Just thinking again about why the government, at least in Britain, seems intent on increasing the labour market participation of mothers of young children, is part of the reason also, baldly, that you get more tax revenue. right? So if you have two parents who are working and they're also employing a nanny, a childminder, a nursery worker, or whatever, you have three people paying income tax and NI. Whereas if you just have the stay-at-home mum and the breadwinner, you get one lot of tax. Do you think that's part of what's going on?
Yes, I think that is part of it. As you say, that it's the sort of 3 for 1. I mean, in the old breadwinner homemaker model, you had one man working and one woman at home. Now you have three people contributing to the GDP economy: the man, the partner woman, and the child carer. And it is true that that boosts tax income to some extent, but it also boosts costs to the state. I mean, the kind of welfare costs to the state, and often, I mean, the child carer will be paying very little, if anything, in tax. The woman, particularly if she's working part-time, may not be paying a huge amount in tax. And it's in some ways a kind of it's a sort of false economy. I mean, look at the latest increase in childcare subsidy. So we currently spend about £4 billion a year on childcare, with the 30 hours a week for children of 3 and 4, and some children of 2 if they're from disadvantaged homes. We're now expanding that at the cost of another 4 to 5 billion to children from 9 months old, despite the fact that a lot of people in child development will say that extended childcare for a child under 2 is really not a particularly healthy or advisable development. But we're spending an extra £5 billion on that extension of the childcare subsidy, and according to the OBR, or is it the Treasury estimates? I can't remember what estimates that I've seen. This will create an extra 60,000 jobs. I mean, for the kind of the subsidy per job is, runs into the hundreds of thousands, I think. I mean, this is not even an economically rational thing to do from the point of view of expanding the GDP economy. And I think a lot of it does have to do with a kind of anti-domesticity bias in our public policy. And this is something that that kind of high status professional men can identify with, high status professional women who think like them about work. But there are millions and millions of women who have very different ideas about that, and the government indeed tells us this through the Department for Education childcare surveys that they do every year. They don't publicise this aspect of it, but they ask people what their ideal arrangements are, and the ideal arrangements are for many for many women that have to go out to work even when children are preschool. The ideal arrangements, I think, is like 2/3 of women who currently go out to work with preschool children would prefer to work fewer hours, and 1/3 would prefer to work not at all. And actually, if you do, now it's true that some of those who are currently at home, I mean, around a bit less than 20% of parents, mainly mothers, are stay-at-home parents with preschool children, and some of those, if they had affordable, decent childcare, would take advantage of it. But if you kind of do the sums, that the number of full-time, mainly stay-at-home mothers would rise from about 20% to about 40%. And we never hear anything about that. Yeah, I mean, I think there is this sense amongst politicians that still there's something old-fashioned and backward-looking about the domestic realm.
Low status.
That and men are doing a good job by helping women follow them into the public realm, and turning their back on these sort of traditional female areas of of expertise and status.
One of the ways in which I think that this is this is creeping into government ways of thinking, at least my impression from having attended some meetings in Westminster and so on this subject is a tendency to talk about daycare, early years care, as early years education. So to regard it as something that's an active good for the child, not just because it enables the mother to get back to the labour market, but because it allows children to, currently we have full-time education from the age of 4. Some people would like to see that shifted down to the age of 1, right, or even 0, and see it as being a contiguous process of education, which is an active good for the child, forgetting that 1-year-olds are extraordinarily different from 4-year-olds, cognitively, extraordinarily different. And I also find, maybe I'm betraying my bias here, but I find that really quite disturbing, that effort to induct the child into state-run institutions from as early a point as possible. I really don't like that. Maybe that's just because I'm instinctively suspicious of the state, but that creep to me seems very sinister, but yes, is in keeping with this idea that there is something low status, undesirable about the domestic environment, even for little children, for whom that environment is the natural one, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is part of the kind of progressive mind as it's evolved over recent decades on this issue. There is a deep suspicion of the family, particularly for people who are regarded as disadvantaged. I have a section in my book about this, and I look at the early expansion of childcare at the end of the last century and the beginning of this one, under a Labour government. And there were a lot of good things they did. I think the Sure Start programme was doing some good work. I mean, rather expensively, it's true, which is why it ended up falling victim of austerity after 2010. But we had a huge expansion of state intervention in the whole early years evolution and childcare itself, and a lot of this happened in the shadow of the tragedy of the death of Victoria Climbié. Do you remember? I think it was in the year 2000, a young child who was abused. I think she was 7 or 8 years old. She was sort of abused by her stepmother and her boyfriend.
Her aunt, I think it was.
Oh, that's right.
Who I actually did an episode on this last year with.
Oh, really?
Anthropologist, Stone Age herbalist. Well, we touched on it because we were talking about African ideas about witchcraft. The reason that they tortured and killed Victoria Climbié is because they believed that she was a witch, which anyway often gets forgotten in safeguarding workshops, which I've attended, which mention her case. But yes, it was an important case in terms of making child services more vigilant.
Exactly, but we then had a lot of the legislation that cropped up in the early 2000s, which sort of happened in the shadow of Climbié, the Every Child Matters paper of government paper of 2002 or 2003, I think it was. You had the whole early years foundation stage emerging, and you had the huge influence of the big 5 children's charities. All of this happening in the shadow of Climbié, which ended up producing this very sort of over-status, and you might even say over-protective, understandable, maybe that was at the time, this sort of over-protective attitude to say carer, child carer infant ratios in childcare, and a very inflexible regime that was created by the early years foundation stage, very academic as well. I mean, the whole, no other country in the world has this essentially a kind of academic framework for infants and children between the years 0 and 5, and we have this incredibly
the earliest curriculum. Yeah,
yeah
every time you go onto like a preschool website or something, it will tell you all the earliest curriculum things they're doing. And I'm like, what do you mean they're two? They
yeah
need to just be playing.
yeah. And you had the introduction of Ofsted, checking up on all the nurseries, and of course on all the childminders, and the overregulation of childminding, which has caused the number of childminders to fall by 70 or 80%. It was often a sort of somewhat cheaper and more flexible version. The woman in the flat round the corner who may not have had very many paper qualifications, but knew and loved children, had children of her own, and was a capable person with. No, I mean, I think a lot of childminders are kind of are happy with aspects of the early years foundation stage. It gives them status in some ways as more than just sort of babysitters, but the whole framework is very inflexible with these very stringent ratios, much more stringent than than ones in comparable countries. That's made the whole thing very inflexible and very expensive, and also this very sort of top down we've got to take the kids away from the family at every opportunity, particularly the so-called disadvantaged kids, which according to I think Every Child Matters described the numbers of disadvantaged children as sort of 3 to 4 million, out of we're talking preschool children of 8 million or something. I mean, so
It's
nearly
almost
half of
yeah.
were categorized as disadvantaged. This has left us with this legacy of very expensive childcare, and that underlying. And again, I think the big five children's charities who are responsible for drawing up a lot of this legislation, they are there often for the children who are abused. There are children who need to be taken away from dysfunctional families, but we've sort of stretched those definitions far further than they should go. Because my basic argument is we've because of this huge sort of psychological status and economic shift from the domestic into the public realm, we've underinvested in it. I mean, I think it's sort of helpful to going back to Amy Wax's rather economistic, dry economistic way of looking at it. It helps to sort of take the ideology out of it to some extent. It's a kind of investment problem. Can we invest enough in the things that we say we want, like the having of more babies, and we actually do have. The looking after of those babies, the looking after old people, of sick younger people, of can we do that while also having enough freedom and autonomy for men and women? I mean, that's the issue, and I think one of the obvious areas where we've got things wrong is in childcare, and we could very easily take that 9 billion annual investment in childcare. I mean, it's extraordinary that they announced this at a time of apparent public spending austerity, just last year, and nobody batted an eyelid. I mean, or the entire political class supported this. Indeed, Labour said they'd sort of go take it further. But instead of handing these vast sums of money to the nurseries, give it to families, give it direct to families, and then they can decide whether to spend it on themselves, therefore enabling them perhaps to stay at home, or one of the parents to stay at home rather than both having to go out to work. Something, by the way, that is a lot of the kind of drive behind this expansion of childcare is that, and until quite recently, childcare only really started at the age of 3. So there was a 2-year gap essentially between the end of maternity leave and subsidised childcare kicking in. Yeah, so I mean we've had this huge increase to kind of bridge that gap, in order to make it easier for more women to return to the workforce more quickly, even though many of them would actually prefer to stay at home in that period, in that preschool period, particularly for the first 2 years. And you could very easily package up that money, that 9 billion quid. You could also front end child benefit. I mean, at the moment, child benefit up to the age of 16, in some cases, the age of 20, is worth a bit more than 20 grand over
if you
that
qualify
period.
for it.
If you qualify for it, that's true.
I don't get any child benefit.
You don't get any at all.
No, I earn too much.
Okay.
I don't really get any of the pro-family stuff, because it's worth saying that this is all means tested.
Yeah.
And it's means tested quite brutally in a way that old age benefits tend not to be. You reach this threshold, you reach a cliff edge, and then suddenly you just lose everything. Well, there are a couple of different cliff edges that you reach, but basically a lot of middle class people will be getting absolutely nothing from the state until their children start school.
For those people that qualify for it, you could, if you front ended, if you gave half of the child benefit for the first 3 years, when you have the biggest pressure on household budgets, the biggest pressure on relationships, that would be another roughly 3,000 a year. And if you added in something that almost all other rich countries have, which is a recognition of family in the tax system, which we do only minimally, you can get up to a kind of package of kind of 8 to 10 grand with some extra spending, but not a huge amount of extra spending, which would be, in a home care allowance of 8 to 10 grand would really make the difference. I think to a lot of families, it would mean that the mother or father could stay at home for those highly stressful early years of parenthood. And I think it would make the country happier. I'm in favour both of making it as easy as possible for mothers to return to work and continue professional careers or just jobs. And we do need a decent childcare system, but we also need to listen to the voices of those women who would prefer to stay at home, and there are a hell of a lot of them, and they are just completely invisible. Completely unheard in the public debate, let alone the voices of the children. And this expansion of childcare is obviously going to be a particular benefit to couples where both the mother and the father are working full time. The number of people, according to British Social Attitude surveys, who support both parents working full time when children are preschool is 9%. There is a massive gap here between
very fringe view
between political class views and ordinary citizen views.
Yep.
And we should be trumpeting this.
Yeah, and it all goes back to your famous anywhere somewhere dichotomy, that this is an anywhere bias.
It is indeed an anywhere bias, and I say rather grandly, this book, The Care Dilemma, is the sort of third in my kind of anywhere critique. I mean, the first one, The Road to Somewhere, was sort of setting out the general case for this education-led value divide between the mainly kind of liberal graduate anywhere worldview, which favours kind of mobility and openness and autonomy, and is comfortable with social change and derives its status from educational and professional success, and the somewheres who tend to be less mobile, less well educated, and derive not so much their status as their identity from place and group, and therefore are much more likely to be discomforted by rapid change and mass immigration and so on. And my second book was focusing more on the kind of education divide and the bias towards a certain kind of aptitude, the kind of cognitive analytical intelligence, and how that has been sort of elevated to really sort of the only aptitude that matters, and sort of symbolized by the famous Tony Blair speech in 1999, saying that 50% of all school leavers should go to university. I mean, what an incredibly sort of unimaginative, unempathetic, anywhere blinkered worldview that represented. Obviously, Blair and everybody around him just assumed that their children would be among the 50% that go. They gave no thought at all to the fact that, if 10 or 15% of people go to university and you don't, then it doesn't really matter. But if 50% go and you don't, then you might very well feel like a second-class citizen. The kind of downgrading of practical abilities and indeed emotional intelligence, and the over elevation. Anyway, that was the second one, and this is basically the undervaluing of the domestic realm. I think is the third big sort of blind spot in the anywhere worldview, and illustrated by that point I made about how the uncritical support for this huge expansion in public subsidy of childcare at a time of very, very stringent control of public spending, which was universally welcomed, and as I say, something that would be of particular value to less than 10% of the population.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. Yes, except that the problem we have, of course, is that we had this one-time boost to GDP, as discussed, right, from this influx of middle-class women into the workforce. It hasn't translated actually to certainly not increased well-being or even really increased wealth. I mean, the period where you really see a rush of women into the workforce is pretty much from the 1990s onwards, even though, of course, second-wave feminism predates that by a couple of decades. We have not seen an expansion of wealth, really, during that period. I mean, we've had stagnant growth in the UK since, 2008, if we're looking at GDP per capita. What we have seen during that period, and what I wonder is one of the key things that's playing into this problem, is a massive boom in house prices. And I have often wondered, but I'm not economically literate enough to pass whether or not this is true, if actually this influx of women into the workforce mostly served to inflate house prices. It didn't actually serve to make families better off. And now we have the problem where housing, particularly in some parts of the country, is so expensive that you need 2 incomes in order to pay the mortgage. You end up with women being funneled into the workforce when they would rather not be, when they have preschoolers, or couples foregoing having children at all, or delaying having children because housing costs are so punitive. And it strikes me that it's all sort of been for nothing, except to the extent that some women have enjoyed, including myself, right? Some women have enjoyed professional work that's meaningful to them and interesting. But in most cases, actually, this hasn't been a net benefit to anyone in particular, except maybe baby boomers whose houses have become much more valuable and who've been able to liquidate that asset. But otherwise, it seems rather circular.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I looked at this for the 1960s, and there did seem to be some effect of house prices being bid up, particularly in more affluent areas, which then produces the pressure, as you say, for more women to go out to work, not just go out to work, but to go out and earn a sort of professional salary in order to, and that produces a kind of unhealthy inflationary house price cycle. I mean, obviously society has benefited enormously from the the huge expansion of female participation at all levels of the labour market, huge expansion of women into the university sector. I think there are now more women PhDs than
Amy
men.
Wax would disagree with you, as you know.
Yeah.
We don't have to get into that, but listeners can listen to my interview with Amy for the contrary view on that take.
There's one little footnote to this, which I think is quite interesting, is the extent to which the public sector has suffered from the removal of those restrictions, which lasted a few decades. Well, it's probably a decade and a half after the Second World War. The famous civil service marriage bar. Just the general kind of lack of expectation or lack of availability of sort of higher professional jobs in the private sector for women, probably right up to the 60s, 70s, meant that the public sector had this amazing free lunch. Some of the most able women in the country were primary school heads or, matrons in hospitals, and their daughters are partners in city law firms. I think this is something that's sort of impossible to measure, but I think one of the reasons why the public sector doesn't work so well any longer is that those women or the daughters of those women are now contributing. They have the greedy jobs at the top of the private sector, and we're left with the kind of second 11, male and female, in the public sector.
Also true, of course, in civil society that it's still the case that a lot of middle-class human capital is still keeping society on the road outside of GDP economy to a large degree. Particularly, I think women who are a bit older and for whom housing pressures are not as acute and so have been able to not work as much, basically, and have been able to run things like local,
No, that's true.
PTA and church groups and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
When those women age out of being able to do that anymore, I think we'll really feel it, because actually they're keeping a lot of community infrastructure on the road for no money.
Yeah, they're basically the matriarchs of Maiden, Mother Matriarch.
Yes, and mostly invisible. And there used to be more of them.
Yeah,
we still have some of them, but we're set to lose them because of this rat race that women are inducted into, where they have to work in order to pay for housing,
absolutely,
etc.
Yeah. Of course, the other cost, of course, there have been significant benefits, and much of the time here we're talking about, as it were, problems of freedom. We're talking about sort of overshoots, good things that have overshot and become less good things, or produced perverse and unintended outcomes. The fact that we have so much greater choice, that particularly women have so much greater choice about their working lives, about who they settle down with, and the increase in female and to some extent male autonomy has obviously been a hugely good thing, but it has had its costs. And one of we were talking about the bidding up of house prices is one thing, but the much greater stress and conflict in relationships as a result of women often doing the second shift, feeling resentful of men not stepping up. I think actually, if you look at the kind of most recent statistics, I think that critique is kind of overdone. I think men have been stepping up actually to a surprising extent, at least in the home, in terms of childcare and domestic labour of various kinds. Much less so in the public care economy. We can perhaps come on to that. But this increase in conflict is this increasing sort of second shift conflict has undoubtedly contributed to unstable family life. This extraordinary and depressing fact that most people are ignorant of, the fact that nearly half of all children in the UK do not live with both of their biological parents at the age of 14.
Yeah.
Don't tell me that is not a big factor behind this epidemic of mental fragility that we are rightly worrying so much about at the moment. Of course, all the sort of Jonathan Haidt stuff to do with, the the iPhone and the social media platforms and the damage that does, particularly to young women, that is undoubtedly a big factor too. But and this nearly 50% not living with both biological parents is a relatively recent thing. I mean, again, you could say that sort of family breakdown on a large scale started in the sort of 70s and 80s and 90s, but it's kind of remained. It's only probably in the early 2000s that we started to see family breakdown on that scale, represented by that statistic, and this is something that is this is there are no simple answers to this, but again, we don't really talk about it. When it comes to kind of family policy, there's basically a complete blank slate when it comes to all the main political parties. There is a kind of understanding that we can't address this. It's too fraught, as one leading social commentator said to me the other day when I challenged him about the fact that he writes a lot about education and poverty and housing, and never does he ever mention family breakdown as a fact. But it's a huge factor behind all of these, behind poverty. I mean, single parent families are obviously massively overrepresented in the poverty figures. Whether it's housing, whether it's crime, whether it's educational performance, it's absolutely massive. And there is a sort of it is the last really big elephant in the room, I think, in social policy that we don't talk about. There's a kind of agreement that it's out of the reach of policy, that it's a sort of protected sort of zone of privacy that we can't talk about.
One of the things that really jumps out when you're looking at the relationship breakdown data, for not just for marriages, but for cohabiting couples as well, is that the first year of their first child's life is the really, really risky year. That's the peak for breakups, and no wonder, because it's very stressful. Everyone's tired. There are financial worries. I mean, this is another problem that comes right from the fact that it's so much more difficult, mostly because of housing costs, for families to live on one income. A lot of women will basically not earn very much during their maternity leave, if they're lucky enough to get it. If you're self-employed, of course, you don't get it. Well, you do get a little bit of money from the state, but it's so measly. It's basically nothing, right? Like, you basically cut your income to almost nothing. Very stressful, right, for people who are going through this as a couple. And I also think, honestly, that I do take the point that men have stepped up and do a lot more. I think the expression used in the book is the domestication of men, right? Like, there has been a domestication of men over the last 50 odd years. Men do more childcare and more housework and so on than they used to. But I think to some extent what we are now asking of men is something that they're not actually very good at. I know that makes me sound really reactionary, but a lot of men are not very naturally suited to looking after a newborn, to managing household tasks, to be the expression that Mary Harrington uses is being the CEO of the house, right? A lot of men are not very naturally suited to that, and it's partly because they regard it as being low status, so they're not very motivated to become adept at it. But I think also that women are often just better at fulfilling this role. And what we've done is basically we've put an enormous burden on the expectation now when you have a baby is that your husband, your partner, the father of the baby, will do everything. You will rely on him enormously. He's the only person that you can really make demands of when you have a baby. And he is expected to do some very, very difficult things alongside earning money, right? Whereas those roles, looking after the new mother, they used to be performed by female kin. They used to be performed by a local network of mostly women who you were related to, particularly maternal grandmothers and sisters and whatever. There were, of course, more of these women because people had bigger families, but also that is the age-old structure that exists to support these people. And we've basically, in many cases, particularly with the anywheres or people who've migrated, we've taken that away and we've replaced it just with the dad. And then we're surprised when people break up, right? Like that
Mm.
seems just, women obviously find themselves lonely and disappointed and stressed, and they tend to blame their partners for it. And I sort of think actually sometimes the partners do fail and are lazy and selfish, but I think a lot of the time it's actually an impossible task, and the whole system is an impossible one. And yeah, it's no wonder that we then have whatever it is, half of children not growing up with both biological parents at home.
Yeah, I think that is true, and you describe it well. As I say, I think men have in the kind of the raw numbers suggest that the kind of the male female distribution of domestic labour has gone from sort of 30-70 to more like 40-60 or even 45-55, particularly in more middle and upper middle class, more highly educated homes. I think what you say, and perhaps particularly in lower income households, and of course, family breakup is hugely class biased in the bottom half of the income spectrum. Much higher probability, much higher levels of cohabitation, and cohabitation is much more unstable than marriage. Much lower levels of marriage in the bottom half, and all of those economic pressures are greater. As you say, maternity and paternity leave are very, very poorly subsidised. And I think a lot of people in the political class don't see this because they don't experience it. I mean, if you've got a decent professional job or a civil service job or whatever, you often get full pay for 6 months or even a year.
Not if you're a police officer. When our first son was born, my husband was working for the police, and he got 2 weeks paid leave, and the rest of it was
Right. Well,
completely
2 weeks
unpaid.
paid leave is the statutory minimum.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I mean, we do need to increase maternity and paternity leave, because you then get into these high stress conflicts that you were talking about. And there obviously is a kind of natural tendency for the woman. I mean, because of maternity leave being longer, breastfeeding, much greater changes to a woman's body, and indeed psychology, often after the birth of a child, that a man doesn't experience in the same way.
And personality differences. I'll say it so you don't have to. But like women's personalities are to a large degree better suited to the work of the home and of childcare than are men's personalities. There are obviously exceptions, but I'd say that in general that's true.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot of evidence. I cite some of it in the book of women sort of gatekeeping, women actually wanting, in theory, men to share equally the domestic burden, but actually being really quite unhappy with it when it happens. I'm the father of 4 children, and when my then wife Lucy was, she was very much the chief executive, and I used to sort of tease her that she had what I called sort of control freak martyr syndrome, that basically she wanted to do everything, but then felt very cross that she was doing everything and blamed me.
Many such cases. Yeah. And I think that the difficult problem is when women are also earning and not really through choice. So when the expectation is that women will do all of this and this asymmetry persists, and then also you have to leave your baby in a nursery and go to work when you don't want to. And it's a very, very common thing among the particularly kind of somewhere women, right? Who you see this a lot on TikTok. Lots of somewhere women on TikTok, not very many of them on Twitter. They'll talk about the profound distress that they experience of leaving little babies in nursery to go back to work. And they are basically, I don't think that we should be, I don't think that the feminist choice historical narrative of this works at all, because actually I think most of these women do not feel as if they have choices, because the only real choice left to them if they decide to do the traditional thing and stay at home is for the household to be much poorer, and particularly when it comes to housing, depending on what part of the country they live in. That doesn't seem like greater autonomy to me at all. It seems like the opposite.
Yeah, and we haven't really touched upon the whole collapse in fertility problem, but I mean, it just seems so obvious that we need, there's a lot of unhappiness out there created by the pressures of the GDP economy and the fact that we're not investing in the domestic realm, it would be at relatively low cost be possible to make it easier for one parent to stay at home. That would change the whole tempo of life in this country, I think, for the better.
I agree with all of this stuff about front-loading child benefit and giving greater flexibility in terms of what existing state spending is put towards in terms of childcare. I'm with you on that. It is, however, different, I think, from sort of truly pro-natal policies, in the sense that until now, government spending, at least in the UK, on children, particularly in the early years, has been done with the intention of alleviating child poverty. So most of the money goes towards the poorest, and it tends to be kind of fixed sums. Child benefit is a universal benefit. It's not that much. It's kind of enough, basically, to provide nappies and a little bit of food. What has never been done, and what is quite far outside of the Overton window still, I think, is to provide sufficient subsidies or tax breaks to actually encourage people to have children who are not poor, right? Because if you just gave, I think the figures you were saying was what, like £9,000 or something. If you just gave £9,000 a year to a woman who is, say, earning £70,000 in a professional job, so she's not earning huge sums, but she's definitely in the higher, she's in the higher tax bracket, that is nowhere near enough to actually account for the opportunity cost that she suffers from having a child.
That's
nowhere
true,
near enough.
Yeah.
If we were going to actually incentivize those, if we were going to make it cost neutral for families in that kind of income bracket to have children, we would have to be giving them so much more money. I mean, we'd be talking like a complete income tax relief, for instance.
You should then focus on minimizing the promotion penalty, so that employers, a lot of this has already happened, hasn't it? That you kind of require a degree of flexibility from employers, that particularly a higher paid professional woman who's presumably desirable to the company, can leave for 2 years or even 3 years and come back and continue where they were. I mean, not everybody will want to. Not every woman who's just had a child or maybe 2 children will want to do that. But those that do want to do that, we need to minimise the opportunity cost to them. And actually, this is what a lot of, what you might call family policy is actually focused on in the last few decades, and what the kind of HR departments, the overwhelmingly female HR departments have rightly focused on, is tried to sort of minimise that cost.
Which is also the good, although you do still leave quite a lot of people, for whom that wouldn't help because they don't do those kinds of jobs. I think, though, but even so, I mean, during that 2 or 3 years where the woman is out of the workforce, she is suffering an enormous, enormous economic hit from not earning during those years. And it's all front loaded. You have to pay it immediately, and you still have rent and mortgage to pay. And I think that it's not unreasonable for people to look at that, given that we basically have an economy set up around the expectation of 2 incomes. It's not unreasonable for people to look at that and say, I can't afford it. And of course, it's not quite true. I mean, I don't, when people say, oh, I couldn't possibly afford to have a child, and you say, well, okay, but the poorest people are the people having the most children, it's not quite true. But they're not wrong to identify the fact that it is basically a very stupid financial decision if you're an ambitious person who aspires to a middle-class lifestyle. And yeah, just handing over, like, let's say the state covers the cost of childcare, full-time childcare. It's not nothing, right? It doesn't actually incentivize those people to have children. And if we wanted a really, really pro-natal policy agenda, we would have to incentivize those people to have children. And also to have lots. Like, just taking 2 years out, that's enough to have one child. If we want people having 3, 4 children, I just think that we're underestimating how expensive this would be. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
But already, I mean, a highly paid professional woman will get 100% of her salary probably for a year. I mean, in most kind of decent, blue chip companies and the high reaches of the civil service, you get close to 100% of your salary covered. So
Do
that
you?
covers,
That
yeah,
sounds nice.
yeah. Um, I mean, yeah, I mean, this is what it may not be true of the police force, but we touched on this earlier. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why people in the political class, I think, are sort of don't realise, just
Because they
how
happen to
difficult
be
it
in these
is
cushy
out
kind
there,
of,
or
yeah.
just how antenatal. I mean, just going back to the sort of broader antenatal critique, the fact that we don't really recognise the family and tax system, so you absolutely wallop single earner households. That we've restricted benefits to 2 children, a quite extraordinary decision, and highly discriminatory against various ethnic minorities as well, who tend to have larger families. And actually, and this is, I mean, one of the points I try and make about sort of pro-natal and indeed sort of pro-domesticity policies more generally, is that although the goal is wrongly but widely considered sort of conservative, with a small c, if not a large c, and yet the kind of means to these goals are often actually quite liberal and progressive. Affordable childcare, decent maternity pay, so that your standard of living does not collapse when you have 1, 2, or 3 children. Men stepping up more, encouraging men to do that with longer paternity leave.
The problem is, of course, as you know, that in countries where all of that is in place, they don't actually have higher birth rates.
That's
Right.
true.
To be the doomer.
Yeah, no, I mean, clearly there are huge sort of cultural issues. Freedom just trumps everything in the modern world, it seems. And as somebody, I can't remember who, someone put it, we're sort of pro-child but anti-natal. I mean, because we invest so much more in a smaller number of children. And you could also say, somebody said this, it may have been on one of your podcasts, that I think it may have been Coleman Hughes actually pointed out that life has become so much better for the average person in a rich Western country just in the last sort of 20 or 30 years. Incomes have, well, they've been a bit stagnant recently, but I mean the incomes have continued to rise. Levels of education have risen. We have the Library of Alexandria in our pockets, on our phones. I mean, the entertainment quality of essentially free entertainment has risen dramatically. The kind of the extraordinary investment in food and food preparation, and the much more wonderful holidays that people can have. Even people on kind of relatively average incomes, or life has got hugely better. Whereas for a parent, if anything, because of the introduction of kind of intensive parenting in the late 20th century for women and men, having and raising children has, if anything, got harder.
Yeah,
That
and more
sort of,
lonely.
and more lonely, and with families smaller and more dispersed, as you were saying. What is going to change that? I mean, what how can one, what is the nature of the thumb, on the scales? Um, can we just hope that people will kind of lean against the sort of informal one-child policy that so many rich countries are head, one child or no child policy, that we will see the sort of cultural poverty associated with that, the unhappiness associated with that. I mean, I guess reasons for optimism: the fact that women or couples still say they want to have more children than they actually do end up having. It's not. I mean, the desired number of children, like the actual number of children, is also declining, but it's still way above the actual number that people have. I mean, it's at least sort of more than half a child. The economic disaster that the fertility collapse is going to bring upon us, it's already there in many ways, but it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And I mean, you're right to say that even countries that are I'm not sure the Scandinavian countries do actually count as sort of explicitly pro-natalist in the way that, say, France or Hungary are explicitly pro-natalist, but they're certainly sort of in effect pro-natalist with their very, very generous parental leave, very, very highly subsidized childcare, etc., and very egalitarian, balance of domestic labor. But the economic disaster that is kind of looming is going to force countries to become. It's not going to happen under this Labour government, or but it may happen under the next Conservative government. Will have to be actually just starting to talk about it. That actually it's a public good to have children, and we are going to do various things, some of which we've talked about, to make that more possible. Stranger things have happened. No one expected the baby boom, after all, did they? In the
it did
40s
take a
and 50s.
world war to.
Although, the thesis that says that it wasn't actually the World War; it was actually to do with improved conditions, various medical changes, refrigeration, various things that changed in domestic life that just made that having children,
white goods, and
maybe technology will come to our aid. If someone can invent a drug to make giving birth completely painless, or to regulating children's sleeping patterns in a completely safe way, is this not possible?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yes. But the episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.